Hi, fibrologist. It's Tony from the Fibrology Lab, and I'm just doing a little an introduction. I have recorded this paper piecing technique demo that is part of this video during a Zoom meeting, so it's not as smooth as it could be, but you still will get the gist of it and the meat and potatoes of how I do paper piecing. So I just want to throw that out there and let you know that this was done in a Zoom. So if you hear me talking to Jill, that was who was watching the Zoom, and then there were some other little things that happened throughout the process. But if you have any questions as you're watching this video, don't hesitate to reach out and ask. I would gladly love to see you be successful in creating something with paper piecing. I hope you enjoy the video.
So this is just the basic. I'm going to kind of go from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. Then this is the way I do it. So like I tell a lot of my students, there's 20 ways to do everything in quilting, but with paper piecing, it's really a personal choice. A couple of tools that I use the add a quarter ruler, and I'm going to show those here. Basically, it's got a little lip on it, so it helps you make 1/4 inch seams, trim them down. A glue pen is another tool I use. We're going to use a Clover roll and press. You don't want to iron your fabric while it's on the paper because the paper shrinks. And I have my snips, my cutter, and my pins. So this is going to be about the Crossroads sampler, which I really do like how a lot of the processes that Scott did in this design. So he tells you exactly how to cut your fabrics. I'm actually going to show you how to measure them because not a lot of patterns tell you what size to cut your piece for your paper piecing. And there's one or two that I would have made a little larger because he gave you very little fudge space. So a couple of things to remember when we are paper piecing. We are sewing on the back side of the project, the back side of the block. So when you look at your pattern, it's always going to be reversed on the front because that is going to be what you want to see. And particularly with this Crossroads, you have two different wedges. You have a left wedge and a right wedge, and you're going to make them 4 times each. And what I do now, when we sent this out as a block of the month, we did black and white because it's cheaper. So what I recommend is going into your pieces and coloring, or either coloring with a color pencil, or take a pencil and say, this is purple, this is the red 1 or red 2, just so you kind of have a visual as you start putting it together so you don't mess it up. And the way he does the paper piecing, he has piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, piece 4. You're going to go in numerical order. It's like color by number. So to me, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't know why I use the word piece, but that's just what he did. And you also see I wrote down the measurements of the fabric. So as I'm in the machine and make sure if it's too small, I'm like, wait a minute, kind of, again, double checking my work as I go along. So a couple of things you want to do paper piecing. You want to change your stitch length to a 2.0 or less. And just depending on your machine, most of them will go 2.0 or 1.8. So a narrow, very fine stitch. I don't know, it's going to be hard to see. Very small. So keep that in mind that it also makes it really challenging to rip out. And you can rip out. Just you make sure you have a very thin a seam ripper, and then if you have to, you can always tape it and sew through tape to fix that pattern if it tears, because there's the paper piecing paper out there that's very easily it tears away, but at the same time, if you need to rip out and reapply, you might need some tape to fix that. So your seam allowance seam stitching should be 2.0 or less. I do recommend a Microtex sharp needle. And the smaller the needle, the better. So like a 70 or an 80 will make the hole smaller and make it easier to penetrate the paper as you're sewing. So a couple of things as we get started. Let's go ahead and figure out, how do I know if my directions on my pattern don't tell me how to cut my pieces? How am I going to do that? So on this piece, let me move my stuff out of the way. You're gonna measure 2 different directions on your piece. So we're going to start with this back piece 3, just because it's big and you can see it on my camera as I'm showing it on my ruler. Oops, there's a big old light circle. I was trying to have more lighting without getting the reflection. There we go. So let me zoom in a little bit. And Jill, stop me if you have any questions. I'm just jabbing along. So we're looking at piece 3. I'm going to use a line on my ruler and just measure it up to this line, because this is the sew line. So if this is piece 1, piece 2, piece 3, that means that's the sew line. And I'll talk about that as we go in progression. But I'm going to put one of the lines on my rulers on the bottom of that line, because that's where I'm going to sew. Then I'm going to slide it down 1/4 inch, because we need that seam allowance under that line. So when I look up here, I'm going to slide it over a little bit. That's the end of the pattern piece. So I'm going to measure up. I'm going to count my inches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it goes right up to the 8 line. So that's what he tells you. I think it's 8 by 8 for this piece, which is fine. So you're going to, when you get to that point, you're always at about 1/4 inch. I like the fudge space, so I add 1/2 inch. So looking at this, it's 8. Well, actually, I did it wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5. He says 8 by 8, but 7.5 will work. Now we're going to go across. Again, using that line as reference, I'm going to bring the ruler. I'm going to use this line and going this way to see how wide I need it. So again, I've got that 1/4 inch on that line. And I'm going to go all the way over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at 1/2 inch. So I would cut this at 5.5 by 7.5, and I will still have plenty of space. I wrote down here my numbers, and in the pattern, he says 8 by 8, which gives you plenty of space. So if you want to be a little conservative, or you're using scraps and you want to make sure they work, that's what you can do. You can trust the pattern. I don't trust patterns. I always check before, especially with paper piecing. And that will give you a little fudge space to work it. So that's what I do. I write down the measurement. I need to cut the fabric, and then I cut my fabric. So what I have done, since this is the next piece I'm going to do, let me get this out of the way. I have pulled out my fabric. I've cut them accordingly to the pattern. Zoom back out a little bit. You can't see what I'm pointing at. And I put them in order of placement. So this is fabric 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That makes it easier. So when I go over to the sewing machine, I just have to pull them up in the order I have them laid down. Now, remember, we're going to put the fabric on the wrong side of the paper. I'm going to grab my handy dandy glue stick. Lots of people like to use pins. I just use a glue stick. It's not going to hurt it. It's not going to make it tough or hard to get off. This is where having that shadow, you can look up at the light. I can't do that with the camera. Hang on, there we go. You take the pad, and once I got that glue on there, put that piece on. I take it to light to make sure. I'm trying to see if that'll show. You can see the fabric goes all the way around. Make sure there's 1/4 inch all the way around. So that's piece 1. Piece 1's done. We don't sew piece 1. Piece 1 is our placement. So the next piece is 2. But before I get to the sew line, so this is piece 1. This is my sew line for piece 2. And then this particular pattern has a gentle curve. So you see that slight curve? It will come out if you sew it on the piece in a slight curve. And I'm going to show you how to hold those pieces in place. So that slight curve, what I do typically for the straight edge is I'm going to line it up on the straight edge and fold the paper over. Because of that curve, I'm actually bringing it to the point and the point. And then I'm going to pull this over. And we're going to fold and crease that paper. And what that does is it's going to make it easier for us to trim our first 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to trim this piece down now using my add 1/4. Now, if you don't have an add 1/4 ruler, you totally can use a different ruler and line it up on that 1/4 inch line and trim that as well. What this allows us to do is when we open the paper back up, flip it over, I know where to place my red fabric now. My piece 2 fabric goes right there on that cut line. So I know I'm going to have 1/4 inch seam allowance. We are sewing on the paper side. So if you pin this in place right now, the pin's going to be under my needle and under near my feed dog. So I'm going to flip it, open up a little bit and stab it basically into place. So now carefully I go over to the sewing machine I am going to tack my stitch down. So most machines nowadays have a tack stitch or a fixed stitch where the needle will go up and down in that spot 3 or 4 times to lock its stitch down. If your machine doesn't have that, you can go forward a couple stitches and go backwards and do a back stitch, or just hold the paper in place really tightly and firmly and let that needle lock that thread in. And we're going to go gently sew it down all the way and do it again on this side. I'm going to walk over to the sewing machine. I don't have a camera to show you exactly the stitching, but let me go over to the sewing machine really quick. I'm going to stitch this line and come back and show you how we're going to apply piece 3, because we're doing piece 2 right now. So now the next one will be 3. So let me sew this line and I'll be right back. As you can see, I've stitched that line. And this is my starting thread. So I'm going to trim that. And then the other side, I don't know if you can see that line, but there's the stitch line I just did. So let me grab my little snips. Trim my thread off. Keep your threads out of the way as you're working. I'm going to pull that pin out. And now I'm going to take this piece, this red piece, and I'm going to actually finger press this. If I take the roller to this, it's going to put pleats and tucks. And because there's a slight curve, I want to keep that curve. So I'm going to kind of pull it with my fingers and just kind of press it so it will kind of lay flat. And as we go through the rest of building up this block, you're going to be doing a lot of holding in place and pinning in place so it doesn't lose that curve. Now you can see it's puckering down here, but when we get it all stitched down, you're not going to see it because there's not a lot of puckering. All right, so now we've done piece 2. Now we need to go to piece 3. So again, we're going to do the same kind of concept where I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to take my add a quarter ruler, and I'm using the add a quarter ruler that has a little bit of a wedge here. I like that wedge because it allows the paper to come up over it and fold down into it. Piece 1 is no sewing. Piece 2, that's our stitch line. Piece 3, it's this stitch line onto piece 1. So we're going to fold it over, creating a crease in our paper. Pull that ruler out. This is the part that a lot of people forget to do, or they cut off the paper, or cut off, which not a lot of people do that, or cut off the fabric in the wrong spot. So we've trimmed it down. I'm going to fold it back out and grab my next fabric on my stack, which is the big 8 by 8 inch piece. And if you need to, you can always look at your fabric too, like this, to see if it's going to fit. Hey, it fits. So we're going to flip this over. Now this point here where the curve starts, I'm going to pull that fabric a little bit this direction. Put the short, and you notice that I'm doing this, I forgot to mention, I am always putting the fabric face down, because then we're going to sew that seam line and then it'll come face up. Now there's a curve here, so it gets going to a little puckery. This is where it's this side, and the other side is where it gets a little tricky to make sure we cover everything. We'll slide this down a little bit, because I want to make sure that curve shows. So I'm going to keep working with my fingers, lining this up. I am going to press on this side for a temporary second so I can flip it over and pin it from the other side, because I don't want that curve to get puckery. There we go. Make sure it went all the way to the edge. You're going to be doing a lot of flipping back and forth to make sure your fabrics are lining up and that everything is going to be on par where you want it to be. Now I'm going to move another pin down here. I know it's probably hard to see this, but and this paper that this particular pattern on is like copy paper, so it's like very thick. Again, I typically like using Carol Doak's paper piecing paper because it's a lot easier to manipulate and work with. So I've got 2 pins just to hold the pieces in. I'm going to sew this line now. Same thing, back stitch or lock your stitches here and do the same thing on this side as well. I'm going to go to my machine and I'll be right back. And you see, I have done this line now. And I missed a little bit. Don't fret. That's just so minute. It's not going to matter. That's when you're going to press it out. So now we've got this piece. We're going to, this is where the roller comes in handy. You couldn't use it here on the curve, but you definitely can use it on your straightaway. You don't want to take it to the iron. Even a dry iron has moisture in the air and it could shrink your pattern. I don't recommend pressing everything until you actually have all your pieces together. So now we just finished 1, 2, 3. Our next piece is going to be 4. Flip it over. This is piece 4 right here. And I'm going to do the same. We're starting to do rinse and repeat processes. I'm going to put my ruler on the line that I'm going to sew on, bring the paper down, fold it, and then trim all that fabric. Look, out of quarter rulers come in a 6-inch size and a 12-inch. We actually have them in sets. I don't know if I have any in stock right now, but it is a tool that I use all the time for paper piecing. There is another tool out there that you can put in between the paper to help things not shift, but I don't worry about that too much. Pull that back out, flip it over. So my next piece is here. I am going, and I know that the bottom edge here is the beginning point of it, which means we're going to back stitch it. Again, see that it's got a, am I showing it right? Okay. Curve in it. We're going to lay it down. And I am going to pin again on this side before I flip it over and pin on the other side. Now I'm going to flip it and pin it in place. Now, when I'm under the machine, I do move the pins as I'm working through it because I don't want them under my foot. But I'm going to start here, back stitching, and up here I don't need a back stitch because it's the edge, so I just come all the way off the pattern. So let me go ahead and do this stitch line. Something else I forgot to mention is I do tend to also, like all this white space, I normally trim down the pattern. I just jumped right into this one. But when I did this pattern, I trimmed it down to about a 1/2 inch around the triangle piece, just so it's not cumbersome under my sewing processes. All right, so this is the other one. We're going to push it out and press it with your roller press. Don't have to be so, if you push too hard on the roller press, it will put pleats and crinkles in your fabric. So just be gentle. Basically want to lay flat. And you can still see it's got a little bit of puckering because there's a curve there. It's just a slight curve, but there's a curve in that space. So we've got, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's go to 5. 5's over here. I'm going to put this down. We will do a start stop lock stitch in that one area as well. See how much extra fabric there is from this pattern. That's why I like to actually measure and use my own measurements, because to me that's a waste. But if you like scraps, then paper piecing is good for you. What I'm doing is lining up the lip. There's a little lip here to the edge of that paper, and it locks it in place so I can just trim it nice and neat off of that. Fold it back out, flip it over. And again, we have a straight air line. Just gonna line up this piece. Again, trying to watch out for that puckering. I don't want that puckering in my block. I'm going to pin it in place here, and then I'll flip. If you hear any noise in the background, I have grandbabies in the house today because they have moved in with us for a little while. Pin and paste 2 down to piece 5. All right, let me go to the machine. I only have 2 more stitch lines on this particular piece. All right, we've got that stitch line down. And you can go as slow as you want. I'm just trying to go fast to make the video go a little quicker. And you can see my curve is staying in place. That's what I wanted. Now we're going to do the same thing for the last piece. Her last is 6. When I flip it over, make sure that fabric is totally open out. See how it's all opened out? Because that's what we want to trim out. I'm going to put the ruler there on this last stitch line. Fold it in half. See all the wrinkly there? That's what we're going to sew off of, sew off into the last piece. Fold this back down. Rinse and repeat. See, there's that little pucker, but when you put it into the stitch, it's going to go away. Where's my last piece? Here it is. I'm going to pin it. I'm going to go back to the machine and sew that last stitch line. And there's no start stop on this. So, oops. Of course, there's people trying to join. All right. So there's no start stop. I'm just going to run off the paper on both sides. So I'm finishing up this last paper piecing process. Oops, I'm trying to get my stuff up. All right, so I've sewn the last stitch line. I'm going to flip it over, and again, just press it out with my rolling press. Now we've got this kind of big wide area. According to the pattern directions, he tells you to cut on the solid line, which builds in that seam allowance. But I have learned I don't trust it. So when I take what I do is I use this inner line and cut a 1/4 inch off of that. And even like looking at my ruler, I don't know if you guys can see it really close up, but it's a little bit short. So this gives me that confidence of it being more space for me to actually piece it to this piece here, which I'm going to show you here in a second. So I'm going to trim this down to 1/4 inch off the stitch line. And now I have this piece all done. And you can see the curve is there. just again, pulling it down, making sure it lays flat underneath this piece. Try to get my camera back to me and not to Lisa. Shoot. There we go. I don't know how this is going to work out. I'm trying to make this. There we go. Okay. So now that if you're again doing the crossroads, you need to do these pieces for each. One's left and one's right. And this is how they're going to go together. And you can see when you go together, it's going to be a block. And you're going to get 4 of these blocks. Now, when I sew pieces together, I line up things. So I know this point is going to line up with this point. So I pin it first. Oops, if I have glasses on, but there we go. I line it up first and then I pin it. Oops. Of course, it's being persnickety because I'm recording. Now, a couple of tips I do with putting these pieces together is I use Wonder Clips. I'm pinning right now because I want to make sure those points line up. And then once I have them all lined up, then I put the Wonder Clips in place. There we go. And so there's one point on this one, and there's another point up here that I want to line up. Again, trying to, there we go. And so now I have a little flip, but I have it in place. So it's a little wiggly. So now I'm going to grab a couple Wonder Clips to hold them in place. Because again, my paper is really thick on this one. So if I put the pins in, it'll shift it too much. And because I want these pins to, these points to really meet up, I will actually start sewing in the middle and work all the way out. I need more Wonder Clips to hold in place. And then I will do the same on this side. And I still haven't torn the paper off. I'm not going to tear the paper off actually until I get all 4 blocks together. Again, that's just my peace of mind to make sure it lays flat until I get them all together, that the measurements are correct, that I'm not shrinking my paper or shrinking my fabric more. But I know people that will take them off after each block. I think of it like English paper piecing. I want to keep it stabilized until the block comes together. So once I get this all stitched down, I will press this open so the bulk is not there. And I will probably rip off the seam allowance part, but I will not rip off the rest of that. So, and then you're just going to sew it, and then you'll end up with that quarter of a mariner's compass for this particular Crossroads block of the month program. And that's a basics of my style of paper piecing. Everybody has, again, their own style, but that's what I do for mine. Hopefully that makes sense. Jill, did that help you kind of remember some things?
It helped a ton. Thank you.
Are you serious? Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yep.
So, and like I said, I will make this a smaller compact video and put it in the group for you to go back to and reference when you're actually ready to sit down. So
perfect.
And the other thing, the common sense pieces, I assume most people do this, but I will say that out loud. Just make sure you use best press or stabilizer product. Iron your fabrics first before you put them in this process, because you want to make sure they do shrink enough that when you put it all together, you're not going to have a cattywampus paper piecing project. So, well, I'm glad that helped you out. Good.